The recycling chutes hummed their eternal song in the depths of New Haven Station, a mechanical lullaby that had become Nix's only constant companion. She pressed her silver cheek against the warm metal pipes, drawing what comfort she could from their steady vibration. Her crystalline hair caught the amber glow of the emergency lighting, fracturing it into tiny rainbows that danced across the grimy walls. 9 years old and alone for 3 of them, Nix had learned the station's hidden pathways like a ghost learns to haunt. The maintenance corridors were her highways, the forgotten storage bays her shelter, and the discarded scraps from the upper levels her sustenance. She moved with the practiced silence of someone who had discovered that being seen often meant being hunted. Tonight something was different. Sweet aromas drifted down through the ventilation systems, carrying scents she couldn't name, but that made her hollow stomach clench with longing. Following her nose had become survival instinct, leading her to food courts where careless diners dropped morsels, or cargo bays where shipping containers sometimes leaked their precious contents. The scent trail led her through a maze of ducts, until she found herself peering through a grate into one of the mid-level residential corridors. Below, warm light spilled from an apartment window, and inside she could see something that made her breath catch in her throat. A small human child sat at a table surrounded by colorful decorations. Adults moved around the room, their faces bright with joy, their voices carrying laughter and songs Nix didn't recognize. But it was the centerpiece that held her transfixed. A circular creation covered in white sweetness, pierced by tiny flames that flickered like captured stars. She watched as the child leaned forward, drew in a breath, and extinguished all the flames at once. The room erupted in cheers and applause, and the child's face glowed with pure happiness. Nix pressed closer to the grate, her silver fingers curling around the metal slats. "What is that?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony of the station's life support systems. She had never seen anything like it in her fragmented memories of her home world, before the evacuation ships and the long journey to this human outpost. There had been ceremonies and rituals, but nothing quite like this intimate gathering of love and celebration. The family began cutting the mysterious white creation into pieces, distributing them among themselves. Each person seemed to receive a portion of the joy, along with their share. Nix's stomach growled, but this hunger went deeper than physical need. This was a hunger for belonging, for understanding, for the warmth that seemed to radiate from that simple room. As the celebration continued below, Nix made a decision. She would find out what this ritual meant, what those flames represented, and why the act of extinguishing them brought such happiness. She had survived 3 years by observing, learning, and adapting. She had a new lesson to master. The scent of sweetness lingered in the air long after the family had cleared away their celebration. Nix remained at the grate, watching until the lights dimmed and the apartment fell quiet. In her mind, she replayed every moment, every gesture, storing them like precious data files in her memory banks. Tomorrow, she would begin her investigation. Tonight, she would dream of flames and wishes, of songs and laughter, belonging to something larger than the endless maze of maintenance, tunnels and forgotten corners that had become her world. Tobias Fletcher had been kneading dough since before dawn, his weathered hands working the familiar rhythm that had sustained him through 40 years of baking. The small shop on Commerce Level C wasn't much to look at, cramped quarters wedged between a parts dealer and a hydroponic supplier, but it smelled like heaven and home rolled into one. At 53, Tobias had seen enough of the galaxy's troubles to appreciate simple pleasures. He'd served on cargo freighters in his youth, hauling supplies to colonies that flickered in and out of existence like dying stars. But after losing his wife to a plague outbreak on Kepler Station, he'd settled here on New Haven, finding solace. In the ancient art of turning flour into comfort, the morning rush was winding down when he noticed her. A slip of silver shadow hovering near his shop window, too quick to catch directly, but persistent enough to register in his peripheral vision. At first, he thought it might be one of the maintenance bots malfunctioning, but the movement was too organic, too purposeful. When he finally got a clear look, his hands stilled in the middle of shaping a loaf of sweetbread. A child alien. By the crystalline quality of her hair and the subtle luminescence of her skin, was watching him work with an intensity that made his chest tight. She couldn't be more than 9 or 10, thin as a whisper and wearing clothes that had seen better decades. Tobias had always been drawn to strays. His wife used to tease him about it. How he'd leave scraps for the alley cats and accidentally make too much soup when refugees were queuing at the aid stations. This child had that same look, wary, hungry but not broken. Not yet, he continued. His work. Pretending not to notice her surveillance while keeping track of her position through the reflection in his mixing bowl. She stayed for nearly an hour, watching him pipe frosting roses onto a celebration cake, her silver eyes tracking every movement with scholarly precision. When she finally slipped away, Tobias made a decision that would have made his late wife smile. He began preparing an extra batch of honey rolls, the kind that could fit easily in small pockets and would stay fresh for days. He'd learned long ago that charity worked best when it didn't feel like charity. The next morning brought her back. Same position, same intense observation. This time, Tobias was ready. He accidentally knocked over a display of pastries near the window, scattering them across the floor in full view of his silent audience. As he cleaned up, he made sure to leave one honey roll on the window ledge, not obviously placed, but available to anyone quick and quiet enough to claim it. The roll vanished within minutes of his return to the counter. By the 4th day, they had established an unspoken routine. Nix, though he didn't know her name yet, would arrive as he began his morning prep. Tobias would find reasons to step away from the window, always leaving something edible in his wake. She never took more than she needed, and she never left. Any trace of her presence, except for the missing food, it was Professor Blackwood, who finally helped him understand what he was seeing. The retired educator had been a regular customer for years, stopping by for her daily coffee cake and philosophical conversations that helped both of them stave off loneliness. "There's a child watching your shop," she mentioned casually one morning. Settling into her usual chair with her usual order. "I've noticed," Tobias admitted, testing the temperature of a batch of cinnamon rolls. "Refugee, most likely. Probably orphaned during one of the recent evacuations." Myra's dark eyes held the weight of someone who'd spent decades trying to help. Displaced children? They're often afraid of adult attention. Too many have learned that notice means deportation, or worse. Tobias nodded, pieces clicking into place. "What would you suggest?" "Patience," Myra said simply. "And maybe ... understanding. These children often come from cultures where food has different meanings, where celebration traditions don't translate cleanly. She might not even understand what she's observing in your shop." That afternoon, Tobias found himself really seeing his workspace through alien eyes. The birthday cakes, the anniversary treats, the holiday cookies, all of it steeped in human customs that might seem as foreign to his young observer as her crystalline hair seemed to him. He made another decision then, one that would ripple through all their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow, he would try something different. Tomorrow, he would try to bridge the gap between her world and his, one gentle gesture at a time. Professor Myra Blackwood had spent 37 years teaching xenocultural studies at the academy before retiring to New Haven Station. Her small apartment on level B was a museum of memories or artifacts from a dozen worlds, photographs of students who'd gone on to become ambassadors and translators, shelves upon shelves of books and languages, both human and otherwise. At 68, she maintained the sharp intellect and insatiable curiosity that had made her legendary among her students. Her dark skin bore the subtle marks of someone who'd spent decades in artificial gravity, and her silver-streaked hair was always pulled back in a practical bun that suggested a mind too busy for vanity. When Tobias approached her about the mysterious child, Mira felt the familiar stirring of academic excitement. She'd always been drawn to puzzles, particularly ones involving cross-cultural understanding. Crystalline hair and luminescent skin, she mused, stirring honey into her morning tea. That suggests Zephyrian heritage, possibly mixed with something else. They're a fascinating people. Their entire society was built around energy cultivation and harmonic resonance. Energy cultivation? Tobias paused in his bread slicing, genuinely curious. Think of it as emotional agriculture, Mira explained. Warming to her subject, Zephyrians believe that feelings and experiences can be grown, harvested, and shared like crops. Their ceremonies aren't just celebrations. They're literal attempts to cultivate joy, peace, or strength within their communities. She pulled out an old tablet, fingers dancing across its surface until she found what she was looking for. Hear this. It's from my field notes during the Zephyrian diaspora 15 years ago. The holographic display showed a family gathering around what looked like a crystalline tree. Children placed their hands on glowing branches, while adults sang in harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer. This is their coming-of-age ceremony, Myra continued. Each child plants a seed of light, literally, a bioluminescent organism, and the family's combined emotional energy helps it grow. The brighter the glow, the more love and support the child feels from their community. Tobias studied the image, trying to imagine what it would be like to grow up in such a world. What happens to children who don't have communities? Who are alone? Myra's expression grew somber. In traditional Zephyrian society, that was almost impossible. They're communal by nature. The idea of a solitary child would be as foreign to them as their energy cultivation is to us. But during the evacuations, she trailed off, the weight of unfinished tragedies heavy in her voice. She's been watching birthday parties, Tobias said quietly, through my shop window. She seems fascinated by the cakes, the candles, the ceremony. Of it all, of course she is, Mira breathed, pieces clicking together in her mind. Don't you see? She's trying to understand our version of energy cultivation. To her, those birthday celebrations must look like our attempt to generate and share joy, which, in a way, they are. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the holographic Zephyrians continue their eternal ceremony. Finally, Mira spoke again. There's something else you should know. In Zephyrian culture, the worst fate that can befall someone isn't death, it's experiencing pure joy or sorrow alone. They believe that unshared emotions can poison the soul, create what they call shadow resonance. Tobias felt something cold settle in his stomach. She's been alone for years, hasn't she?
Most likely.
And if she's truly Zephyrian, or even part Zephyrian, she's probably carrying more emotional weight than any child should bear. Mira leaned forward, her teacher's instincts fully engaged. But here's the beautiful part: she's reached out. By watching, by learning, she's trying to heal herself. She just doesn't know how to ask for help. What can I do? Myra smiled, the expression transforming her scholarly features into something warmer, more grandmotherly. You're already doing it. You're feeding her body. Now we need to feed her spirit. But it has to be on her terms, in her time. She stood and moved to one of her many bookshelves, pulling out a slim volume bound in iridescent material. This is a collection of Zephyrian celebration rituals, translated into standard. Some of them might be adaptable to human customs. Tobias accepted the book reverently, feeling the slight warmth it radiated. You really think this could help? Think, Mira said carefully, that somewhere in this station is a little girl who's forgotten how to cultivate joy. I think the universe has put her in the path of someone who makes happiness for a living. She patted his shoulder gently. The question isn't whether you can help her, Tobias. The question is whether she'll let you try. As he walked back to his shop, the book tucked safely under his arm, Tobias felt the weight of possibilities settling around him like flower dust. Tomorrow, he would begin reading. Tomorrow, he would start learning how to speak the language of celebration in a way one lonely, luminous child might understand. Yarrick Voss had worked the maintenance tunnels of New Haven Station for 12 years. And in all that time, he'd prided himself on knowing every pipe, every conduit, every forgotten corner of the massive structure. So when his motion sensors started registering anomalies in Sector 7G, he took it personally at 45. Yarrick was built like the heavy machinery he maintained, solid, dependable, and intimidating to those who didn't know him. His scarred hands spoke of years wrestling with stubborn equipment, and his permanent scowl had been earned through countless encounters with bureaucrats who thought maintenance was optional. Most people avoided him, which suited Yarrick fine. come to New Haven after losing his family in a mining accident on Europa 3. And solitude had become his armor against further pain. He did his job, collected his pay, and asked nothing from anyone. But these sensor readings were driving him crazy. Bloody ghost in the machine, he muttered, checking his readings for the dozenth time that morning. According to his instruments, something small and warm was moving through the ventilation system with impossible stealth, appearing and disappearing like smoke. He'd been tracking the anomaly for 3 days when he finally cornered it. Emerging from a maintenance hatch in the early morning hours. He found himself face to face with the most unusual child he'd ever seen. She froze like a startled deer, silver skin pale with fear, crystalline hair catching the emergency lighting in prismatic flashes. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the gruff maintenance worker and the ethereal refugee child, two unlikely inhabitants of the station's hidden spaces. "Well, hell," Jarek said finally, his voice softer than he'd intended. "You're not exactly what I was expecting to find." The child, Nix, though he didn't know her name yet, tensed as if ready to bolt. But something in his tone, perhaps the absence of anger or threat, made her pause. "Easy there, kid," Jarek continued, settling his considerable bulk onto a nearby pipe junction to make himself less imposing. "I'm not going to hurt you. But these tunnels aren't safe for someone your size. Half these conduits carry enough current to stop a grown man's heart." She tilted her head, studying him with those impossible silver eyes. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know which ones are dangerous. I've been careful. Have you now?" Despite himself, Jarek was impressed. Navigating the maintenance areas safely required considerable technical knowledge. "How long have you been living down here?" 3 years, she said simply, as if discussing the weather. The matter-of-fact delivery hit Jarek harder than any sob. Story could have 3 years. She'd been surviving in his domain for 3 years, and he'd never known. The thought made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. That's a long time to be alone," he managed. "I'm not alone," Nix corrected. "I have the station. It sings to me." Jarek blinked, then realized what she meant. The constant hum of machinery, the whisper of air through vents, the distant thrum of the fusion reactor she'd learned to find comfort in the station's mechanical symphony. "Yeah," he said gruffly. "I suppose it does sing, doesn't it?" They fell into an odd companionship after that. Jarek began leaving safe food in areas where his sensors detected her presence. Military rations that wouldn't spoil, water purification tablets, emergency thermal blankets. He never mentioned it directly, just as he never questioned when his equipment inventories came up slightly short. It was Tobias who eventually connected the dots. The baker had been implementing Professor Blackwood's suggestions, leaving small gifts that honored both human and Zephyrian customs. Odd. But someone else was clearly helping. The child was cleaner, warmer, more confident than someone surviving entirely alone should be. When Tobias finally approached him, Yarek's initial response was his usual surly deflection. But something in the baker's earnest concern wore down his defenses. "She's good people," Jarek admitted grudgingly, accepting a cup of coffee in the baker's small back office. "Smarter than half the engineers I work with, and more polite than any of them." "She watches birthday celebrations," Tobias shared. "Professor Blackwood thinks she's trying to understand how we cultivate joy, I suppose. But she seems afraid to get too close." Jarek nodded slowly. "Makes sense. The kid's been hurt before, probably more than once. But she's not giving up, which says something about her character." They sat in comfortable silence, two unlikely allies, bound by their mutual concern for one small, luminous child. Finally, Tobias spoke. "There's something I want to try. A celebration that might help her understand she's not as alone as she thinks. But I'll need help, someone who knows the station's systems, someone she trusts." Jarek met his gaze steadily. "What did you have in mind?" As Tobias explained his plan, Jarek felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not for himself, for a silver-skinned child who'd learned to find music in machine noise and family in the vast emptiness of space. Maybe it was time. To help her discover that the station's song could include more than just the hum of electronics, the plan came together like a delicate recipe, each element carefully measured and timed. Tobias consulted Professor Blackwood's Zephyrian texts, learning about energy cultivation and harmonic resonance. Yarick mapped the perfect location, a forgotten observation deck where the station's hull was transparent, offering an unobstructed view of the stars. Mira provided historical context and cultural sensitivity, and Nix, unknowingly, provided the most important ingredient of all: hope. It took them 2 weeks to prepare. Tobias practiced new techniques, blending human baking traditions with Zephyrian concepts of shared nourishment. He created a cake that would glow softly when touched, its bioluminescent frosting responding to warmth and emotion. Yarick quietly rerouted power systems, installing gentle lighting that would pulse in harmony with heartbeats. Myra researched celebration songs that could bridge to worlds. They knew Nix's routine by now: her morning observations, her careful scavenging, roots her evening retreats to the safer depths of the station. On the appointed day, Yarick left her a different kind of gift, a maintenance badge that would grant her access to the observation deck, and a simple note written in Zephyrian script that Mira had translated: "Your family awaits you among the stars." When evening came, Nix found herself standing before a door she'd never dared to approach. The badge felt warm in her palm, pulsing with the same rhythm as her nervous heart. Behind this threshold lay either another disappointment or something she'd given up hoping for. She opened the door and stepped into wonder. The observation deck had been transformed into something between a human birthday party and a Zephyrian harmony circle. Bioluminescent streamers, carefully cultivated organisms that Mira had special ordered, danced in the artificial breeze. The cake sat at the center of everything, its soft glow responding to the presence of people, growing brighter as emotions intensified. But it was the 3 figures waiting for her that made Nix's breath catch in her throat. Tobias stood beside his creation, flowers still dusting his apron, his kind eyes reflecting the cake's gentle radiance. Yark leaned against the observation window, his usual scowl replaced by something that might have been a smile. Professor Blackwood sat in a simple chair, her silver hair gleaming like starlight, ancient wisdom and infinite patience written in her features. "Happy birthday, Nix," Tobias said softly, using the name she'd finally shared during one of their wordless exchanges. "But it's not my birthday," she whispered, still frozen in the doorway. "When was your last birthday?" Mira asked gently. "Nix thought hard, silver brow furrowing. I don't remember. Before the evacuation. Before my mother died. Before." "Then we have some catching up to do," Yark said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion he'd thought buried forever. What followed was unlike any celebration in human or Zephyrian records. They sang songs in multiple languages, some traditional. Others improvised on the spot, shared stories of their homeworlds, their losses, their hopes. The cake responded to each tale, its glow shifting colors as their emotions ebbed and flowed: blue for sorrow, gold for joy, silver for the complex feeling of belonging. When it came time for candles, Tobias had prepared something special. Instead of traditional flames, he'd arranged small energy nodes that Professor Blackwood had described from her research: tiny lights that would respond to breath, to wishes, to the focused intention of the one making them. "In human tradition," Tobias explained, "you make a wish before blowing out the candles. In Zephyrian culture, you share your intention with your family so they can help it grow." Nix looked around at the 3 faces surrounding her: baker, maintenance worker, teacher, and realized she was looking at something she'd thought lost forever: a family, chosen rather than born, bound by care rather than blood. "Was she," said slowly, her voice growing stronger with each word, "to never forget that being alone and being lonely are different things. And I wish to help others remember that too." She leaned forward and breathed gently across the energy nodes. They flickered once, twice, then settled into a warm, steady glow that matched the rhythm of 4 heartbeats beating in harmony. The artificial night deepened around them. They sat together on the observation deck, sharing cake that tasted of stardust and dreams. watching the endless dance of distant suns. Nix curled up between Tobias and Yarek, her crystalline hair catching the light from Professor Blackwood's tablet as the older woman read stories from a dozen worlds. For the first time in 3 years, the station's song included laughter. And Nix finally understood what birthdays were truly for. Not to mark another year of survival, but to celebrate another year of becoming who you were meant to be, surrounded by those who help you remember that growing up doesn't have to mean growing alone. The celebration lasted until dawn, when the first shift workers began moving through the corridors below. But the glow from that shared cake and the family it had helped create would illuminate the darkest corners of New Haven Station for years to come.